A millionaire was on the brink of danger, and no one wanted to help him. It was a poor boy who extended his hand and changed everything. In desperation, the rich man promised to give all his fortune in exchange for help. And from this unlikely encounter was born the greatest turnaround of all. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching from. We continue. I promise this will be the best story you'll hear in your life. The sky over Riverdale dawned with heavy clouds that Monday. The workers at Hope Springs Farm watched anxiously as the black Jaguar slowly climbed the dirt road, raising dust wherever it passed. Inside the vehicle, Richard Miller adjusted his Italian tie, bothered by the heat that was beginning to permeate the interior of the car, despite the air conditioning running at maximum. "How much longer until we reach this backwater place?" he asked the driver with evident impatience in his voice. "5 more minutes, sir," replied the man, accustomed to his boss's temperament. Richard sighed, running his hand through his perfectly trimmed grey hair. At 58, he was the portrait of corporate success, CEO of Miller Enterprises, one of the largest companies in the country, built with cold decisions and precise calculations. His motto had always been, "Efficiency above feelings," a phrase he repeated in every board meeting before announcing staff cuts or closing less profitable units. The farm he was visiting now was just another asset to be acquired, with its 500 acres of fertile land and a strategic location for his new ventures. It represented a potential profit of millions. The fact that it was a century-old property, sustaining dozens of families for generations, was just an inconvenient detail to be overcome with zeros on a check. The car finally stopped in the coffee yard. Richard got out, smelling the strong aroma of freshly harvested beans. He wrinkled his nose, unaccustomed to such natural and intense aromas. His impeccable suit completely clashed with the simple environment around him. "Welcome to Hope Springs Farm, Mr. Miller," said a firm voice behind him. As he turned, Richard met Anthony Parker, the current owner of the farm. A man with calloused hands and a face marked by the sun, dressed simply but with a look that demonstrated dignity. "Let's get straight to the point, Mr. Parker," Richard replied without extending his hand. "My time is valuable, and we both know why I'm here. My proposal is in this envelope. It's generous considering the state of the facilities." Anthony received the envelope without opening it. "Perhaps you'd like to see the property first. Understand what we're doing here." Richard looked around with disinterest. "I've seen enough in the reports. This land is worth more for what it can become than for what it is today. Frankly, these production methods are archaic. In 6 months, I can triple the yield with automation and dismiss half of these workers who only generate unnecessary costs." A few meters away, partially hidden behind a column of the main house, Gabriel Wilson, a 17-year-old young man, observed the scene attentively. Son of Mary, the farm's cook, he had grown up there among the coffee plants and the stories of the elders. In his hands, a small brass medal nervously spun between his fingers, a family relic he always carried with him. "Is that the man?" whispered Mrs. Carmen, an elderly lady who approached Gabriel. The young man nodded, clutching the medal more tightly. "It's him. I recognized him from the portrait Grandpa kept." Gabriel knew exactly who Richard Miller was. His grandfather, Sebastian Wilson, had dedicated 25 years of work to Miller Enterprises, receiving that medal as recognition for his loyalty. However, in a corporate restructuring, he was dismissed without notice, without adequate compensation, just a number in a cost-cutting spreadsheet. The shock caused him to lose his house in the city, his dignity, and eventually his health deteriorated. The family never fully recovered from the blow. "Don't let bitterness take your heart, my child," said Mrs. Carmen, touching the young man's shoulder. "Remember what your grandfather always said." Gabriel took a deep breath, recalling the words he had heard so many times. "True transformation doesn't come from vengeance, but from education. A hardened heart needs to be taught, not destroyed." Meanwhile, Richard continued his superficial inspection, making derogatory comments about everything he saw. He criticized the outdated irrigation system, the inefficiency of manual harvesting, the waste of time with sustainable practices that the farm had adopted. Gentlemen, you're stuck in the last century. This place has the potential to be a cutting-edge agro-industrial complex, maybe even a luxury condominium. Why insist on this rural romanticism that only brings losses? Anthony remained calm, but his eyes revealed contained indignation. This land isn't just a business, Mr. Miller. It's home to families. It's part of the history of this region. The coffee we produce is internationally awarded precisely because of these methods you call outdated. Richard laughed with disdain. Sentimentality. The market doesn't care about stories, only numbers. And the numbers say you're losing money every day you maintain this operation as it is. It was at this moment that Gabriel, driven by an impulse, came out of his hiding place and walked toward the two men. Mrs. Carman tried to stop him, but the young man was already determined. "Excuse me," said Gabriel, his voice firm despite the nervousness. "Have you visited our community school? That's where we show that the future and the past can walk together." Richard looked at the young man with surprise, not expecting to be interrupted by a teenager. "And who might you be?" "Gabriel Wilson, sir. I study at the community school and also work on the farm on weekends." The young man extended his hand, which Richard shook automatically, more out of reflex than cordiality. "Community school?" questioned Richard, confused. "I didn't see anything about that in the reports." Anthony smiled for the first time since the businessman's arrival. "It's our greatest pride, Mr. Miller. Built with collective effort, it serves not only the children of the farm workers but the entire region. Perhaps you'd like to see it." Richard was about to refuse when he noticed something familiar in the young man's face, a resemblance he couldn't quite place. Moreover, the medal that dangled from Gabriel's neck caught his attention. It was identical to the ones his company used to distribute to its most loyal employees decades ago. "Where did that medal come from, boy?" he asked, suddenly interested. Gabriel held the object firmly. "It was my grandfather's, Sebastian Wilson. He worked 25 years in your company." The name hit Richard like an invisible punch. Sebastian Wilson, one of the employees from the great restructuring of 1999. Richard vaguely remembered signing lists of dismissals, hundreds of names that represented necessary cuts for the company's survival in times of crisis. He never thought he would one day meet the grandson of one of those signatures. An uncomfortable silence settled in, broken only by the distant sound of workers in the plantation and the singing of birds in the mango trees that surrounded the yard. "I have a different proposal," Gabriel finally said. "Instead of you telling us how we should change, how about getting to know what we're already building? One day. That's all we ask before you make your final decision." Richard hesitated. His instinct told him to refuse, to maintain the objectivity that had always guided his business. However, something about that young man, the medal around his neck, and the mention of his grandfather's name intrigued him. "One day," he finally answered. "Tomorrow, I have important meetings in New York." "Actually," interrupted Anthony with an enigmatic smile, "we're having a problem with the farm's generator. Your car will need to be towed, and the mechanic only arrives tomorrow morning. It seems that fate wants you to spend the night with us." Richard frowned, suspicious. "Is this some kind of trap?" Gabriel smiled, and in that smile there was a mixture of firmness and compassion that disconcerted the businessman. "No, Mr. Miller, it's an opportunity, for you and for us. My grandfather always said that even the hardest heart can learn new lessons if it's willing to listen." At that moment, a thunderclap cut through the sky and the first raindrops began to fall, as if nature itself sealed that unexpected agreement. Richard Miller, the man who controlled a business empire, found himself, for the first time in decades, without control of the situation. And so, against all his instincts, he accepted the invitation, not imagining how those next 24 hours would completely transform his worldview and business perspective. The rain increased, and everyone ran to the main house. Richard's journey in Riverdale was just beginning. The rain continued falling mercilessly throughout the afternoon. Richard Miller was accommodated in a simple but clean and cozy room on the upper floor of the house. The wooden walls exuded a characteristic aroma that mixed coffee and old wood. Through the window, he watched the rain transform the road into an impassable mud pit, confirming that he really wouldn't be able to leave any time soon. "Excuse me." "Sir," said Mary, Gabriel's mother, entering with a tray. "I brought some fresh coffee and homemade cookies." Richard noticed the resemblance between mother and son immediately, the same expressive eyes, the same determined chin. "Thank you," he responded dryly, still uncomfortable with the situation. "Dinner will be served at 7 on the back porch," she informed before withdrawing. "Gabrielle would like to show you something before, if you'll allow it." Richard consulted his wristwatch, a Patek Philippe that cost more than a year's salary for all, the farm workers combined. "I'll be available in half an hour," he replied, more out of politeness than interest. When Mary left, Richard tried to make some calls, but discovered there was no cell signal. No internet, no contact with the outside world. He suddenly felt vulnerable as he hadn't felt in years. He pushed away the sensation with irritation and tasted the coffee. He was surprised to find that it was extraordinarily good, full-bodied, aromatic, with notes he had never experienced in the expensive coffees he consumed in New York. 30 minutes later, Gabriel knocked on the door. "May I come in, Mr. Miller?" Richard made an affirmative gesture, noticing that the young man was carrying some books and a folder in his hands. "I thought you might like to know a little more about our project before dinner," said Gabriel, placing the material on a small table. "What project exactly?" asked Richard, yielding to curiosity. Gabriel opened the folder, revealing detailed graphs, spreadsheets, and photographs. "We call it Roots of the Future. It's an integrated model of agricultural production, education, and technology that we've developed over the past 5 years." Richard took the sheets, impressed against his will with the organization and professionalism of the material. He didn't expect to find such detailed market analyses, financial projections, and feasibility studies in a farm he considered backward. "This is surprising," he admitted. "Who developed these projections?" "Me and other students from the community school under the guidance of the teachers," replied Gabriel with evident pride. "We have a technology laboratory built with recycled computers. Some former students who now study at the best universities in the country also help us remotely." Richard examined the numbers carefully. The project demonstrated how the farm could triple its production and profit in the next 5 years, without dismissing employees or abandoning sustainable practices. In fact, the plan included hiring more people and expanding preservation areas. "This completely contradicts my analysis," commented Richard, frowning. "With all due respect, sir, your analysis didn't consider our greatest asset," replied Gabriel. "And what would that be?" "The people, the knowledge accumulated over generations, the way we integrate tradition and innovation." Richard was about to retort when he heard animated voices coming from the lower floor. Gabriel smiled. "It seems the guests have arrived for dinner. Come meet them." Going down the stairs, Richard was surprised to find the back porch transformed. A large table had been arranged, and about 20 people were talking animatedly. Anthony made the introductions. "Mr. Miller, these are some of our partners and collaborators. Teachers from the school, neighboring small producers, our agronomist, our biologist." Richard shook hands mechanically, noticing that each person greeted him with respect, but without the fearful reverence he was accustomed to receiving. Dinner was served, a simple but tasty meal, prepared with ingredients from the farm itself. During the meal, Richard observed the interactions. Ideas were openly discussed, debates happened without rigid hierarchies. A young man of approximately 25 years was speaking enthusiastically about a drip irrigation system he was developing, specifically adapted for local conditions. Lucas was our student, explained Gabriel, seated next to Richard. He earned a full scholarship for environmental engineering and came back to implement the knowledge here. "Why come back?" questioned Richard. "He could earn 3-4 times more at a multinational." Lucas, who had heard the question, answered himself. "Because here the impact is real, Mr. Miller. I see the results of my work in people's lives, in the land, in the water that becomes cleaner. What sense would it make to accumulate money without purpose?" Richard felt uncomfortable. Accumulating money without purpose was exactly what he had done in the last decades. After dinner, while everyone helped clear the table, including the children. Anthony invited Richard for a walk around the property. The rain had ceased, leaving the air clean and fresh. "What did you think of our little dinner?" asked the property owner as they walked under the starry sky. "Different," replied Richard with sincerity. "I've never seen so much horizontality." "In my company, hierarchies are very clear," Anthony smiled. "Hierarchy doesn't necessarily mean absolute control. Here we respect the experience and knowledge of each person. Mrs. Carmen's youngest son, that 10-year-old boy you saw, already knows how to identify coffee pests better than any trained agronomist. He learned from his father, who learned from his grandfather." They stopped in front of an illuminated shed. From inside came the sound of young voices. Anthony opened the door, revealing a room equipped with about 15 computers where teenagers and adults were working in concentration. "Our technology center," introduced Anthony. "It operates 24 hours a day. In the morning, classes for children. In the afternoon, training for adults. At night, project development." Richard observed, astonished, a group of young people programming what appeared to be a drone monitoring system. In another corner, a girl of approximately 15 years was explaining artificial intelligence algorithms to 2 older men. "But where did all this come from?" "From necessity and creativity," replied Gabriel, who had quietly joined them. "When we don't have resources, we invent solutions. These computers were assembled with parts discarded by companies from New York. The software was developed by ourselves. The internet comes through a system of antennas we built." Richard realized something that wasn't in his meticulous reports. There was a pulsating collective intelligence in that place, a capacity for adaptation and innovation that none of his analysts had captured. "Come see this," called Gabriel, leading him to a table where a 3-dimensional hologram showed the farm's topography. "This is the project we're developing for the next 10 years. It expands production, recovers degraded areas, implements new solar energy systems." Richard examined the project with critical eyes, but found no obvious flaws. "Impressive," he murmured. "But I still don't understand why you're showing me all this. If the goal was to convince me not to buy the property, you could simply have refused my offer." Gabriel exchanged a look with Anthony before answering. "We don't just want you not to buy the farm. We want you to understand why we do what we do, and maybe we can build something together." "Together?" repeated Richard, confused. Anthony nodded. "A partnership. Your company has resources we don't have. We have knowledge and a collaboration network your company doesn't possess. Together, we could create something truly revolutionary." Richard felt disoriented. Throughout his career, his commercial interactions were based on domination, not collaboration. He bought, absorbed, restructured. The idea of a genuine partnership was alien to him. Upon returning to the house, Gabriel led him to a small library. The walls were covered with books, many visibly old and well-maintained. "I'd like you to see something," said the young man, removing a wooden box from a shelf. From inside, he took out a set of letters, yellowed by time. "These were my grandfather's. He wrote them in the last months before becoming very ill." Richard felt a lump in his throat. "Are they addressed to me?" Gabriel shook his head. "Not directly, he never sent them, but he wrote as if he were talking to you." With slightly trembling hands, Richard opened the first letter. The handwriting was firm, despite the author's advanced age. "If I could speak with you again, I wouldn't ask for my job back. I would only ask that you look at the faces behind the numbers. Each name on your dismissal list is a family, dreams, struggles. I don't ask for compassion, Mr. Miller. I ask for vision. Her company that doesn't see the human is doomed sooner or later to lose its own humanity." Richard felt the weight of those words. He vaguely remembered Sebastian, a quiet, efficient man who always arrived early and left late. How many times had he passed him in the hallways without really seeing him? "Why are you doing this, Gabriel?" he asked, suddenly feeling vulnerable. "Why don't you simply hate me? It would be easier." Gabriel smiled, a sad but determined smile. "Hatred doesn't build anything, Mr. Miller. My grandfather taught me that until his last day. Don't waste your energy hating, he would say. Use it to transform. In that moment, something broke inside Richard, an invisible barrier that he had built over decades to protect himself from the emotional consequences of his purely rational decisions. He suddenly saw himself as he really was, a man who had traded genuine connections for numbers in a bank account, who measured success by the fear he inspired, not by the respect he earned. "Tomorrow, I'd like to see your school," he finally said, "if the invitation is still open." "It always was," replied Gabriel, "from the moment I recognized you getting out of that car." That night, for the first time in many years, Richard Miller slept without taking his insomnia medication. His sleep was deep and surprisingly without the nightmares that frequently tormented him. He dreamed of coffee fields with children, running between rows of plants, with the serene face of a man who told him, "It's never too late to start over." When the sun rose, illuminating the room through the simple curtains, Richard woke up with a strange sensation, something that took a few moments to identify: hope, an emotion he had forgotten how to feel. The morning in Riverdale dawned with a clear sky and the aroma of fresh coffee filling the house. Richard woke up feeling strangely rested. It had been years since he had slept so well without the help of medications. Opening the window, he saw the movement in the farm's yard. Workers arriving with their backpacks, children running toward a distant building, and the golden sun illuminating the coffee fields that extended as far as the eye could reach. He dressed in the same clothes from the previous day, realizing with some embarrassment how his Italian suit and shoes seemed out of place in that environment. As he went down for breakfast, he found the table set on the porch, homemade breads, cheeses, fresh fruits, and a steaming thermos of coffee. "Good morning, Mr. Miller," said Mary, placing a plate of cornbread on the table. "I hope you slept well." "Surprisingly well," replied Richard with sincerity. "This coffee, is it produced right here?" "Yes, sir. It's our special variety, manually harvested and roasted on the day." Gabriel named it Memory because, according to him, each cup tells a story. Richard tasted the beverage again, noticing nuances he had ignored the night before. It was truly extraordinary, complex, full-bodied, with a perfect balance between acidity and bitterness. "Ready to see our school?" Gabriel appeared on the porch, wearing a simple white shirt and jeans. He carried a worn backpack on his back and a tablet in his hand. Richard nodded, surprising himself with his own curiosity. "Your car is being fixed," informed Gabriel. "But I'd prefer you to see our path on foot. It's only 20 minutes walking, if you don't mind." The two followed a trail between the plantations. Richard, unaccustomed to walking on irregular terrain, soon felt his feet hurt in his elegant but inadequate shoes for the occasion. Gabriel, noticing his discomfort, commented with gentleness. "There's a saying in this region. To know the land, you must feel it under your feet. You're having an authentic experience." Richard couldn't avoid an ironic smile. "It wasn't in my plans to have such a visceral experience." As they walked, Gabriel explained the intercropping system they used: coffee shaded by native trees with complementary crops between the rows. "This increases biodiversity, protects the soil from erosion, and even diversifies our income," he explained. "But it reduces planting density," observed Richard. "You could have 30% more coffee plants per acre." "Yes, we could," agreed Gabriel. "But in 5 years, we would have impoverished soil, dependency on expensive chemical fertilizers, and inferior quality coffee. Our approach seems less efficient in the short term, but it's much more sustainable and profitable in the long term." Richard reflected on that. His entire career had been built on maximizing immediate results without much concern for future consequences. Quarters, not decades, guided his decisions. They finally arrived at a clearing where a set of modern buildings stood, constructed with a harmonious mixture of traditional and contemporary materials. A large solar panel covered part of the roof, and a wind turbine spun gently beside it. The contrast with the rustic installations of the farm was surprising. "Welcome to the Sebastian Wilson Community School," announced Gabriel with evident pride. The name hit Richard like a physical impact, The school carried the name of Gabriel's grandfather, the man whom his company had discarded as an obsolete resource. Sebastian, your grandfather. Gabriel nodded. The community decided to honor him. He always believed that education was the only true path to social transformation. As they entered the main building, Richard was greeted by an explosion of colors, sounds, and activities. Children of all ages occupied different spaces in a dynamic that seemed chaotic at first glance, but soon revealed itself to be meticulously organized. In one corner, boys and girls of approximately 8 years were building small robots with recycled materials. In another, teenagers were debating in front of a screen where complex graphs were displayed. A middle-aged woman with gray hair tied in a simple bun approached. "Professor Miller, good to see you've arrived. The third-year students are eager for your programming class." Gabriel smiled. "Helena, this is Richard Miller, CEO of Miller Enterprises. He's visiting us today." The woman extended her hand firmly. "Professor Helena Martinez, Pedagogical Coordinator. Welcome, Mr. Miller." "Professor?" questioned Richard, looking at Gabriel. "3 times a week," confirmed the young man. "I teach programming and social entrepreneurship. The other days I study agricultural engineering remotely." Professor Helena led them on a tour of the facilities. Richard observed, impressed, how cutting-edge technology coexisted with traditional teaching methods. In one room, young children were learning to read and write using tablets. In the next room, teenagers were cultivating a hydroponic garden controlled by computer. "Our philosophy is to integrate technical, scientific, and traditional knowledge," explained Helena. "Children learn programming code and, at the same time, planting techniques that their great-grandparents developed, advanced mathematics, and oral stories from the community, English, Spanish, and also the local dialect of the region's ancient settlers." Richard was genuinely impressed. "And the results?" Helena smiled with pride. "In the last 5 years, 100% of our graduates have been accepted to public universities, many with full scholarships. But most importantly, 70% come back to apply their knowledge here like Gabriel." They visited the science laboratory, where students analyzed soil composition and developed natural biofertilizers. In the music room, a group was rehearsing with traditional instruments alongside sophisticated electronic equipment. In the library, rare books about the region's history shared space with e-readers and a scientific content download center. "How do you finance all this?" asked Richard, mentally calculating the investment necessary for a structure of that caliber. "Multiple sources," replied Gabriel. "Part comes from the farm's own production. We have partnerships with national and international universities. Our former students who work in large companies contribute regularly, and we sell our knowledge. Those biofertilizers you saw being developed are already commercialized in 3 states." During lunch served in the school's cafeteria, Richard sat among students and teachers. He talked with a 16-year-old girl who had developed an algorithm to optimize water use in irrigation. He heard a 12-year-old boy explain how artificial intelligence could help predict pests in plantations. "None of these young people would be hired by my company," confessed Richard to Gabriel later, as they observed a practical class in the experimental field. "They wouldn't have the formal certifications we require. They wouldn't pass the HR filters. And you would be losing extraordinary talents," replied Gabriel without rancor. "People who solve real problems, not just those that appear in standardized tests." After lunch, they were led to a small auditorium. To Richard's surprise, dozens of people from the community had gathered there. Anthony Parker was present, along with farm workers, teachers, and many faces that Richard didn't recognize. "What is this?" he asked, suddenly uncomfortable. "We wanted you to formally know our proposal," replied Anthony, inviting him to sit in the front row. A group of young people, including Gabriel, positioned themselves at the front. With the aid of slides and 3-dimensional holograms, they presented a detailed partnership plan between the farm and Miller Enterprises. The proposal was innovative. Richard's company would invest capital to expand production and modernize certain aspects of the operation. In exchange, It would receive a share in profits and exclusive distribution rights for premium coffee. However, management would continue to be shared, sustainable practices would be maintained and expanded, and part of the profits would be directed to the school and social projects in the region. Our calculations indicate a return on investment of 22% per year, explained a young engineer, displaying meticulously elaborated financial projections. Superior to the market average and with controlled risk. Richard analyzed the numbers, impressed with the precision and depth of the analysis. It was a solid plan, which would transform that local operation into a nationally, perhaps internationally relevant enterprise. However, there was a condition that left him particularly uncomfortable. "We'd like you to commit to spending a month a year here," explained Gabriel. "Living in the community, actively participating in decisions, directly knowing the human impact of the business." A murmur ran through the auditorium. Some seemed to doubt that an executive like Richard would accept such a condition. "Why?" questioned Richard. "Why do you insist so much on my physical presence? I could designate a team, do regular video conferences." It was Mrs. Carmen, the elderly lady that Richard had briefly seen the day before, who stood up to answer. Her voice, although soft, carried a firmness that silenced the environment. "Because numbers on a spreadsheet don't show tears, Mr. Miller. Reports don't convey smiles. Video conferences don't allow feeling the smell of the earth after rain or the heat of the sun on your back during harvest." She walked slowly until she was face to face with Richard. "You need to know the faces behind the numbers. You need to dine in the homes of families who depend on this work. You need to see children learning and dreaming of a future that you can help build or destroy with a single decision made in your air-conditioned office." Richard felt the weight of those words. He suddenly remembered his own childhood, before the corporate empire, before money and power. Son of a small merchant from the interior, he had grown up knowing the name of each client in his father's store, hearing their stories, understanding their needs. When had he forgotten the value of that human connection? "There's one more person I'd like you to meet," said Gabriel, interrupting his thoughts. He led Richard out of the auditorium toward a small house near the school. "On the way," he explained, "my grandmother, Mrs. Louise, Sebastian's widow. She insisted on speaking with you personally." Richard felt his stomach contract. Facing the widow of a man whose livelihood he had taken away decades ago wasn't in his plans. But something inside him, perhaps that dormant humanity that was beginning to awaken, told him he needed to face the real consequences of his decisions. The house was small but welcoming, with colorful flowers in the front garden, and a porch where an elderly lady with white hair and a serene face awaited them in a rocking chair. Seeing them, she opened a gentle smile that completely disconcerted Richard. "Finally we meet, Mr. Miller," she said, extending her wrinkled hands. "Sebastian always said you would come one day. It seems he was right, as always." Richard squeezed, her hands unable to find adequate words. How could that woman receive him with gentleness after everything? "Please sit down," invited Mrs. Louise. "We have much to talk about regarding the future." Sebastian would have liked this. And so, under Gabriel's attentive gaze and Mrs. Louise's enigmatic smile, Richard Miller faced the greatest challenge of his life, rediscovering his own humanity and relearning the true meaning of success and fulfillment. The twilight covered Riverdale with orange hues when Richard sat on the porch of Mrs. Louise's house. Fair steaming cup of coffee rested in his hands, while he attentively listened to the story that the lady told with a serene but firm voice. "Sebastian never took that medal off his chest, you know," she said, showing an old photograph where her late husband appeared smiling, the same medal that Gabriel now carried shining against his shirt. Even after everything, he believed that his work had been important, that he had contributed to something greater. Richard looked at the photograph, finally recognizing the man's face. He vaguely remembered him, always punctual, always efficient, discreet. The type of employee who did the work without fanfare, keeping invisible gears functioning perfectly. "Sebastian believed in companies, Mr. Miller," continued Mrs. Louise. He believed that commerce and industry could transform lives for the better. What he didn't understand was how someone could build something grand while forgetting that it's people who sustain this grandeur. Richard felt the weight of those words. In his world of ascending graphs and valued stocks, he had completely lost the human dimension of business. When he became ill, proceeded Mrs. Louise, we couldn't keep the house in the city. The medicines were expensive, and without health insurance, well, you can imagine. We sold everything and came here where Anthony, an old friend, welcomed us. "I'm sorry," murmured Richard, words that sounded inadequate in face of the real suffering that his corporate decisions had caused. "I'm not telling this to make you feel guilt," said the lady with surprising gentleness. "The past doesn't change with regrets. I'm telling it because you need to understand what we built from the pain, how we transformed what could have been just bitterness into something greater and more beautiful." Gabriel, who observed the conversation in silence, intervened. "Grandpa used to say there are two types of responses to injustice: vengeance or transformation. Vengeance repeats the cycle. Transformation breaks it." Mrs. Louise nodded, her eyes shining with contained tears. When Sebastian realized he wouldn't recover, he began to dream of this school. He said the children of the region needed to learn more than just agricultural techniques. They needed to understand economics, technology. They needed to know how the world that frequently exploits them works. "Knowledge is the only thing no one can take from you," he would say. Richard listened to that story with growing understanding of the real impact that his corporate decisions had on concrete lives. They weren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. They were entire families, communities, dreams undone and reconstructed. "That's when we began to put the pieces together," explained Gabriel. "The community donated the land. Grandpa's former work colleagues helped with the construction. Retired teachers offered themselves as volunteers. A small project transformed into something none of us could imagine. And now we've reached a crossroads," concluded Mrs. Louise. "You have the power to enhance all this or to destroy it with a single decision. The question is, what kind of legacy do you want to leave, Mr. Miller?" Richard stared at the horizon, where the sun was slowly setting. For decades, his legacy had been measured in acquisitions, mergers, market valuations. But there, before that elderly lady, who had every reason to hate him, and nevertheless received him with dignity and wisdom, those metrics suddenly seemed empty. "I need to think," he finally said, rising. "May I walk a bit?" "The path to the overlook is especially beautiful at sunset," suggested Gabriel. "I can accompany you if you wish." "I'd prefer to go alone if you don't mind," replied Richard. "I think I need to put some ideas in order." The trail to the overlook was steep, testing Richard's physical limits, unaccustomed to walking on irregular terrain. Sweat ran down his face, staining his expensive shirt. Curiously, that physical discomfort seemed necessary, like a small penance for the excessive comfort in which he had lived, isolated from the real consequences of his decisions. At the top, the view was spectacular. The entire extension of the farm revealed itself, with its coffee fields in different stages. The preservation areas where native forest grew dense and vigorous, the main house, the school, the small houses of the workers. In the distance, the lights of the small town were beginning to turn on. Richard sat on a rock, breathing deeply. For the first time in years, perhaps decades, he allowed himself to simply be present in the moment, without his mind occupied with the next deal, the next acquisition, the next fiscal quarter. He remembered his own father, a modest merchant, who knew each customer by name, who extended credit to families in difficulty, who understood that a business was more than transactions. It was relationships, trust, community. When had he lost that understanding? At what moment had the idealistic young man, who dreamed of building something meaningful, transformed into a man who measured value only in zeros to the right? Night was already falling when Richard returned to the main house. To his surprise, he found his driver waiting for him on the porch, along with Anthony and Gabriel. "Your car is fixed, sir," informed the driver. "We can leave when you want." Richard nodded, feeling strangely reluctant to leave that place which, in just 2 days, had provoked so many questions and reflections. "Before I go," he said, turning to Anthony and Gabriel, I'd like to give my answer to your proposal." The two exchanged apprehensive looks. "I will not accept the partnership on the proposed terms," declared Richard, observing the immediate disappointment on the faces in front of him. Then he completed, "I propose different terms." During the next hour in the farm's improvised meeting room, Richard Miller surprised everyone with an unexpected counter-proposal. He would not only agree to spend a month a year in the community, but he suggested creating a management council, where workers, students, and community representatives would have equal decision-making power as executives from his company. He proposed a permanent investment fund for the school, with guaranteed autonomy for its pedagogical management. And, most surprisingly, he suggested a formation program where young people from the community could intern at his company, and high-ranking executives would spend sabbatical periods learning at the farm. "I'm proposing a true exchange," explained Richard, "not just of financial resources, but of knowledge, worldviews, experiences." Gabriel observed him with a mixture of surprise and admiration. "You really understood the spirit of what we've built here." "Not entirely," admitted Richard with newly discovered humility, "but I'm willing to learn." Documents were drafted, preliminary terms established. Richard insisted on a special clause. The educational program would be officially named Sebastian Wilson Institute, and one of the first initiatives would be a support fund for former employees of Miller Enterprises who had been dismissed in restructuring processes. When he finally prepared to depart, already late into the night, Richard was surprised by one last gesture. Mrs. Louise approached, carrying a small wooden box. "Sebastian wanted this to be delivered to you one day," she said, extending the object. Inside the box, Richard found a medal identical to the one Gabriel carried, along with a note yellowed by time. "For when you understand that true value isn't in what we accumulate, but in what we build together. With hope, Sebastian Wilson." As 6 months had passed since that transformative encounter in Riverdale, spring covered the coffee fields with small white flowers, heralding an abundant harvest. In the main office of Miller Enterprises in New York, an equally profound transformation was happening. Portraits of employees had replaced the expensive abstract paintings on the walls. The executive floor, previously isolated, was now connected by an open staircase to the other floors. And in Richard's office, a particularly significant change. Sebastian's medal occupied a prominent place on his desk, along with photographs of the school and community. The news of the unusual partnership between a corporate giant and a family coffee farm had generated waves of surprise in the market. Initially, shareholders demonstrated concern with what they considered excessive philanthropy. Analysts predicted a drop in shares and loss of competitiveness. What no one expected was that Miller Enterprises would register the best quarter in its history. The introduction of premium coffee from Hope Springs Farm in international markets had been a resounding success. The story behind the product, the innovative partnership, the commitment to sustainability and social impact, had created an intangible value that increasingly conscious consumers were willing to pay for. More importantly, the internal culture of the company was beginning to change. Executives who visited the farm returned with new perspectives. The internship program for young people from the community injected freshness and innovative ideas into the most traditional departments. Richard, who was already on his third visit to the community since the initial agreement, observed this transformation with growing satisfaction. He discovered that his greatest legacy wouldn't be measured in acquisitions or market value, but in the real impact on the lives of concrete people. That afternoon, sitting on the school's porch with Gabriel, they discussed expanding the educational program to neighboring communities. "I never imagined I would find purpose so late in life," confessed Richard. "I always believed that success was a matter of growing numbers." Gabriel smiled. "Grandpa used to say it's never too late to start over, to see beyond the obvious. Wisdom is in recognizing when it's time to change direction." Richard nodded, watching a group of children playing in the courtyard. Among them, children of executives from his company who now studied part of the year in the rural school, learning values that no elite school could teach. "You know what impresses me most," reflected Richard. "You could have chosen the path of resentment, of retaliation. You would have every right." Gabriel touched the medal around his neck, that symbol of loyalty that now represented something much greater. "That would only have perpetuated the cycle," he replied with serenity. "We decided to break the cycle and build something new. As Grandpa used to say, don't waste energy cultivating grudges when you can use it to cultivate dreams." In the Giwam distance, the sun was beginning to set, illuminating the coffee fields with a golden glow. Richard felt a peace that no bank account, no private jet, no mansion had ever provided. He finally understood that true wealth was not something you accumulated, but something you shared. And so, among the coffee fields of Riverdale, two seemingly incompatible worlds, that of capital and community, of efficiency and humanity, of profit and purpose, found a harmonious balance, showing that another way of doing business is not only possible, but can be even more prosperous and meaningful. The medal in his pocket, now a constant reminder of his own rediscovered humanity, shone silently. It was more valuable than any corporate award, than any market recognition. It was the symbol of a transformation journey that had begun with an unexpected encounter and a young man who chose to educate instead of confront, to illuminate instead of accuse, to build instead of destroy. Richard looked at Gabriel, and in that moment saw not just the grandson of a man whom his company had wronged, but a master who, with wisdom beyond his years, had taught him the most important lesson of his life, that even the heart most hardened by numbers can relearn to beat to the rhythm of compassion and genuine human connection. The end. Dear listeners, we hope that Richard and Gabriel's journey has touched your hearts. This story reminds us that transformation and new beginnings are possible at any stage of life. To continue this journey of emotions and reflections, we've prepared a special playlist with equally inspiring stories. Find it here clicking on your left. If this narrative resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave your like on the video. Every day we bring unique stories that explore the complexities of life and the possibilities for transformation. What did you think of this story? Have you witnessed or experienced a similar personal transformation? Share with us in the comments your experience.